There are moments in life when character isn't just tested, it's carved in fire. In a world where judgment is too often passed not by merit but by appearance, there comes a time when a single man's truth collides head-on with society's prejudice. And when that happens, the veil of injustice tears wide open for all to see. This isn't just a story about confrontation. It's not even a story about a uniform or a badge. This is a battle between ego and honor, between ignorance and enlightenment, between a man who thought power meant control, and a warrior who knew power means restraint. The man you're about to meet didn't seek recognition. He didn't wear medals on his chest for approval. He walked with quiet dignity, forged by discipline and sharpened through sacrifice. But on one ordinary day, in one ordinary parking lot, a confrontation would ignite that would test not just the integrity of a single man, but the moral compass of an entire community. This is where the curtain lifts, where the truth walks calmly into the storm, and where one racist cop picked the wrong man to mess with. The sun had barely risen over the small town of Elmswood, Virginia, when the rhythmic humming of tires on asphalt announced the return of someone who hadn't walked its streets in years. Darnell Hayes, a highly decorated Navy SEAL, sat behind the wheel of his matte black Ford Raptor, cruising past familiar landmarks that seemed both unchanged and hauntingly different. Trees arched gently over the two-lane roads, and the morning dew clung stubbornly to the blades of grass in front yards that lined the suburban neighborhoods. It was quiet, peaceful even, but beneath that peace was a tension Darnell had never quite been able to ignore. He hadn't been back in nearly 6 years. His deployments took him across oceans and into war zones, places where silence meant danger and a second's hesitation could mean death. But this silence in his own hometown felt different. He'd seen things few others could imagine, but the war he knew on the battlefield didn't prepare him for the cold stares, the whispers, and the wary looks that had chased him out of Elmswood as a teenager. Now he was returning a hero, at least on paper. In this town, he wasn't sure what he was. The familiar cracked sidewalks of Magnolia Street passed under his gaze as he slowed near his childhood home. The brick house with green shutters still stood strong, but time had weathered it. Paint peeled slightly from the window sills, and the porch swing hung a little crooked. Still, it was home. His mother's garden bloomed in the front yard, just as it had when he was a boy, wild, colorful, and unapologetically alive. Darnell stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching the gravel. He stretched his tall frame and inhaled deeply, taking in the mix of lilacs, pine, and the faint tinge of morning humidity. The air was different from the sterile, recycled oxygen of Navy vessels. This air carried memories of scraped knees, bicycle rides, and long summer nights with cousins on the porch. His mother, Elaine, stood in the doorway, wrapped in her favorite knitted shawl. Tears glistened in her eyes as she opened her arms, and he rushed into them, the years collapsing in an instant. Her embrace was warm, firm, and familiar, the kind of embrace that reminded him no matter how far he traveled, no matter how much danger he faced, this woman would always be his anchor. "You look strong," she whispered, stepping back to admire the grown man in front of her. "But you always did have that look in your eyes, like you could take on the world." "I've had to," Darnell replied with a small smile. Inside the house, little had changed. The same family photos adorned the walls, telling stories of birthdays, graduations, and milestones. On the mantel was a new addition, a framed newspaper clipping about Darnell's recent award ceremony, where he had received the Navy Cross for heroism. Elaine had circled the headline in red pen, "Local hero saves team from ambush in Syria." Pride radiated from every inch of the home, But even as he unpacked and tried to relax, Darnell couldn't shake the feeling of tension. He was a man who had fought terrorists, rescued hostages, and endured the unthinkable. But Elmswood held a different kind of danger, one rooted in the subtle yet sharp claws of racism and small-town prejudice. He had left this town not because he wanted to, but because he'd been pushed away. The wrong looks, the unjustified stops, the way teachers treated him differently, none of it had ever really gone away. Still, he wasn't here for the town's approval. He was here to spend time with his mother, to reset, and to remember who he was outside the uniform. Civilian life was temporary for now, but it was necessary. The Navy had given him structure, purpose, and distance. But Elmswood held the truths he needed to confront before moving forward. Later that morning, he grabbed his wallet and keys and decided to make a quick run to Carter's Grocery, the small local store a few blocks away. It had been there since he was a child, owned by the same family for decades. As he pulled on a fitted black t-shirt and jeans, the muscle memory of home came rushing back. Walking through this town was different now. He wasn't a teenager anymore, vulnerable and alone. He was a grown man, a warrior trained to respond to threats with precision and force. But he hoped he wouldn't need any of that today. He stepped outside and locked the door behind him, tipping his cap to a neighbor who offered a hesitant wave. The streets were mostly empty, the town still waking up as he made his way toward the grocery store. Carter's Grocery was one of those small town staples, the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, or thought they did. The sign above the entrance had faded over the years, but the familiar chime of the bell above the door still rang the same when Darnell stepped inside. A few elderly folks milled about, and a teenage cashier stood behind the counter scrolling through her phone. Darnell moved with casual confidence, picking up a few essentials: bread, eggs, a carton of milk, and a box of cereal he hadn't seen in years. He kept to himself, offering polite nods to the few people who looked up to notice him. Some eyes lingered a little longer than he liked. He'd grown used to that look, the double take, the cautious glance that asked questions people never said out loud. In a town like this, a black man with a strong build and calm authority didn't go unnoticed, even if his name was whispered with reverence on military forums across the country. After checking out, Darnell stepped out into the bright morning sun, juggling the paper grocery bag in one hand and his keys in the other. That's when he noticed a police cruiser idling at the edge of the parking lot. It wasn't the car that caught his attention. It was the way the officer inside stared at him, unblinking, probing. The cruiser's door opened, and a white officer in his early 40s stepped out. Stocky build, buzz cut, mirrored sunglasses. He approached with a swagger that Darnell recognized immediately. Not confidence, but control. The kind of control used to put others on the defensive. "Hey," the officer called out sharply, "hold up a minute." Darnell paused, one foot already at his truck. "Something wrong, officer? Let's see some ID." Darnell raised an eyebrow, his voice steady. "May I ask why?" "You were acting suspicious in the store. Got a call about someone matching your description. Just a quick check." "I was buying groceries. That's not suspicious." "Don't get smart with me. Let me see your ID." A couple nearby turned their heads, watching the exchange. Darnell remained still, composed, but inside he felt the quiet fire building. He knew this game. The vague accusation, the flimsy reason, the flex of authority. "My name is Darnell Hayes," he said slowly, placing the grocery bag on the hood of his truck. "I have no reason to be stopped, but if you're serious about this, I'll cooperate. For the record, I didn't do anything wrong." "Let me be the judge of that," The cop snapped, stepping closer now, hands where I can see them. Darnell raised both hands slightly. He knew better than to argue. De-escalation wasn't just training, it was survival. More people began to gather. Phones emerged. Someone whispered, "That's the Hayes boy. Didn't he join the military?" The officer didn't seem to care. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing the edge of his holster. "Are you carrying any weapons?" "No, officer." "You military?" "Yes." "What branch?" "Navy." The cop sneered, unconvinced. "Got proof of that?" Darnell reached slowly toward his back pocket. "I'm going to pull out my wallet." Slowly. "You're welcome to keep your hand on your holster if that makes you feel safe. But I'm not a threat." The tension was thick. Whispers grew louder. Cameras pointed now. The crowd was growing. The officer watched him closely, lips tight. Darnell's fingers moved with surgical precision, pulling out his wallet, flipping it open, and revealing not just his driver's license, but also his active military ID card, complete with insignia, clearance level, and a photo taken less than 6 months ago. He held it out without a word. The officer leaned forward, squinting behind his mirrored sunglasses as he inspected the ID cards Darnell held out. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the leaves on the edge of the parking lot and brushing against Darnell's neatly pressed shirt. For a moment, the silence between them stretched, thick, heavy, loaded with intent. Then, without returning the IDs, the officer said flatly, "You said you bought groceries." Darnell nodded. "Yes, from Carter's. Got a receipt." Darnell blinked once. "It's in the bag." The officer didn't ask permission. He reached over and rifled through the paper bag on the hood of the truck, pulling out the thin strip of paper and scanning it like it held some hidden clue. A small audience had begun to form, their curiosity now piqued by the cop's persistence. It was clear from their expressions that they recognized Darnell not from school days, then from the local paper or word of mouth. After all, it wasn't every day a local kid made it out and came back a war hero, but none of that mattered now. The officer's focus was razor sharp, as if proving a point meant more than upholding the truth. He held the receipt in one hand and looked up again. "Got a call about someone shoplifting. Black male, about 6 feet, muscular build, black t-shirt, jeans. That you?" Darnell let out a small breath through his nose. "That could describe a lot of people. Doesn't change the fact that you fit it. Doesn't make it true either." That statement, calm as it was, seemed to irritate the officer. His stance shifted slightly, his posture tightening. To him, Darnell's confidence must have looked like defiance, and defiance, especially from someone who looked like Darnell, was often treated as provocation. "You're getting mouthy. I don't need an attitude. I'm not giving you one." Darnell replied, his voice still level. "I'm answering your questions, cooperating fully. You have my ID, you have my receipt. You saw me come out of the store, you saw me pay, so I'm asking you, what exactly am I being accused of?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around, as if searching for someone to back him up. But the cashier inside the store was still glued to her phone, and the small cluster of onlookers outside weren't offering any support. The moment stretched longer, uncomfortably so. Finally, the officer took a step back, folded the receipt in half, and tossed it on the hood beside the bag. "Doesn't mean you didn't stuff something in your pants before you left." There it was, the accusation. Blunt, baseless, thrown out like a challenge. Darnell stiffened. He stared directly at the man now, the air between them buzzing with the electricity of insult. "That's a serious accusation," he said slowly. "If you didn't steal anything, you got nothing to worry about." The officer said smugly, "Except my dignity." Darnell muttered under his breath, "What was that?" I said. Darnell repeated more clearly that I've served my country for over a decade. I've worn a uniform every day of my life to protect people. People like you, officer, and now you're standing here accusing me of theft with no evidence, just because I fit a vague description. It's called doing my job. No, Darnell countered, his tone now edged with the faintest steel. It's called profiling. You're not here because you think I stole something. You're here because of what I look like. And you're using a flimsy call as a shield to justify your suspicion. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. One woman shook her head. A man in a delivery uniform muttered something under his breath and started recording. The officer noticed. His jaw tensed, but he didn't back down. Let's not make this more than it is, the cop said. It already is. Darnell replied evenly. Despite the cop's escalating aggression and the baseless accusation that hung in the air like thick fog, Darnell didn't flinch. His years in combat zones had taught him how to breathe under pressure, how to remain composed in the face of provocation. And though his fists itched with the instinct to stand up, to fight the injustice in the way his body knew best, his mind held firm. He had nothing to prove. His very presence, standing tall and unapologetic in the face of a man who wanted him small and submissive, was proof enough. I'm not going to raise my voice, Darnell said. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to put my hands on you. I don't need to. I know who I am. The officer's mouth twitched. Is that supposed to impress me? No, Darnell said plainly. It's to remind myself because people like you don't care. People like you don't want to see me as anything more than a suspect, a threat. And if I let myself forget who I am, if I let myself respond the way you want me to, then I lose, and I won't give you that. The air around them had gone still. Even the background noise of the town, the distant bark of a dog, the low hum of cars, seemed to fade. The officer's sunglasses reflected only Darnell's face back at him, and in that mirrored gaze was the quiet, immovable force of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to stand for. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Someone said, "Ain't that Darnell Hayes, Navy guy?" Another voice chimed in, "That's him. Saved his whole unit, got a medal and everything." The officer seemed to hear it too. His posture faltered for half a second. Darnell noticed. "I've stared down insurgents," he said. "I've been shot at from rooftops, pulled friends out of burning vehicles, patched wounds under fire, and yet this moment, right here, is still dangerous, because men like you, with power and prejudice, can twist a peaceful morning into a headline. I don't have prejudice," the cop snapped. "Then prove it. Walk away." The officer took another step forward instead, eyes narrowing. "You trying to tell me how to do my job?" "No," Darnell said. "I'm telling you how not to abuse it." The stillness cracked then, as if those words shook something loose. A sharp breath from the crowd. The cop's nostrils flared, but he didn't respond right away. Darnell didn't move. He stood with the calm certainty of someone who'd been through worse, who had nothing to fear from a badge and a bitter heart. His eyes never left the officer's. His shoulders were relaxed but firm. He wasn't backing down. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to threaten. His calm was the threat, his dignity the weapon. And in that moment, it became clear to the officer, to the crowd, and to Darnell himself, that he wasn't just standing his ground for him. He was standing it for every time someone like him had been questioned, accused, belittled, and broken in silence. This time, there would be no silence. The stillness was short-lived. As the intensity of the interaction between Darnell and the officer simmered in the air, the energy around them began to shift. One by one, The bystanders lining the edges of the parking lot raised their phones. Some had started recording as soon as the confrontation began, sensing from experience or instinct that what was unfolding was more than just a routine stop. A woman in scrubs, standing near her car with a coffee in hand, held her phone high and angled it just right to capture both Darnell and the officer. Her eyes were wide but focused, lips pressed in a tight line. Next to her, a teenager on a skateboard whispered something to his friend before hitting record. A man in a mechanic's uniform leaned against his truck, arms crossed, phone steady in one hand, the screen glowing with the red recording light. The murmurs had become a steady hum of commentary. People were reacting in real time, some whispering to one another, others narrating quietly into their cameras. What they were witnessing had all the hallmarks of an injustice they had either heard of or seen before, only this time it wasn't a headline. It was happening in front of them. "That's Darnell Hayes," one woman said into her phone. "He's a Navy SEAL, came back just a few days ago. This cop's got no reason to be hassling him." Another voice joined, lower and more emotional. "Man served this country and still gets treated like a damn criminal. This is messed up." From within the store, the teenage cashier had noticed the growing crowd and ambled over to the entrance, pulling out her own phone and beginning to film through the glass. She wasn't sure what was happening, but the officer's tone and posture looked wrong. Aggressive, tense. Her gut told her this was something worth capturing. Darnell didn't flinch at the cameras. He barely acknowledged them. Years in the service had taught him how to focus under pressure, and while the presence of witnesses offered a layer of protection, he wasn't relying on it. He was grounded in his own control, his own truth. But he was also aware, keenly so, that the crowd's attention was now acting as a buffer against the worst possibilities. The officer, however, did notice. His eyes flicked around, taking in the phones, the faces, the fact that he was no longer operating in the shadows of authority, but under a spotlight that would not blink. The reflection of those phones in his sunglasses was a silent warning. Every word, every move was being documented. There would be no erasing this moment, no rewriting it with a falsified report. Still, he seemed undeterred. If anything, the crowd's presence only appeared to agitate him further. His stance grew more rigid, his voice a little sharper. "You all recording, fine, won't change a thing. If he's done nothing wrong, he's got nothing to hide." But his voice lacked the conviction of earlier. The authority that had surged through his tone before now wavered, replaced by something else, uncertainty, maybe even fear. He was no longer the sole storyteller. The narrative was slipping from his grasp. Someone in the back of the crowd called out, "You're harassing him. Let him go." Another voice added, "We got it all on video, man. This goes online. You better be ready." The tension pulsed in the air like static. The officer straightened his shoulders, gritting his teeth behind a forced expression of control. The crowd wasn't moving. The phones weren't lowering, and Darnell, he stood there, calm, unmoving, the weight of 1,000 miles of discipline etched into every line of his frame. Feeling his control unravel, the officer's frustration began to morph into something uglier. His voice, once posturing as professional, turned colder, sharper around the edges. "Turn around." He barked at Darnell, stepping closer. "Put your hands on the vehicle." "For what?" Darnell asked, not moving. "You're being detained for further questioning. Possible theft investigation. I showed you the receipt. You have no evidence, no stolen items. You haven't been called by store staff. This is harassment, plain and simple." "You don't get to decide that," the officer snapped. He reached for his belt, not quite pulling his cuffs but brushing against them. The implication was clear, even if the motion was subtle. The air in the parking lot changed again. What had been a crowd watching an unjust accusation was now an audience fearing escalation. "No, no, no," someone muttered, "don't you dare. He didn't do anything." Another voice shouted. The phones moved closer. Some bystanders began stepping forward, closing the circle. Darnell's jaw clenched, his eyes locking onto the officers. "I will not resist, but I'm telling you, on record and in front of everyone here, you're about to make a mistake." That statement, delivered with the unmistakable calm of someone who had dealt with far more dangerous men than this officer, only seemed to fuel the fire. I said, "Turn around." The officer shouted now, louder, one hand finally gripping the cuffs. "Hands behind your back." But Darnell stood his ground. His voice dropped to a near whisper, so steady it almost didn't belong in this chaotic moment. "If you place your hands on me without cause, you're going to be the one breaking the law." The officer moved in closer, lips pulled into a grimace. His chest rose and fell rapidly now, emotion overriding reason. His fingers twitched near the cuffs, but his face showed hesitation. A single move could trigger a reaction that would echo far beyond this parking lot. From the crowd, a woman stepped forward, phone still raised. "I'm live streaming this," she said, "to over 500 people right now. We're watching you. Make the right choice." The officer paused mid-step, turning just slightly to register her presence. It wasn't just phones anymore. It was live. It was happening in real time. His badge number had already been called out. Faces in the crowd were already mentioning his name. His reputation, his career, and maybe more were now hanging in the balance of this one moment. The cop's jaw shifted, clenching so hard the muscle jumped in his cheek. His ego wrestled with the reality pressing in from all sides. Still, the tight grip on his cuffs didn't loosen. "You don't give me orders." He spat at Darnell. "You're not in charge here." Darnell didn't flinch. "Neither are you, not when you're wrong." The cop's hand twitched. The crowd stepped in closer. The line between law and abuse had become razor thin, and everyone there could feel it. Just as the situation seemed ready to boil over, a single voice rose from the back of the crowd. Not loud or aggressive, but unmistakably firm and commanding. "That's enough, officer." The officer, mid-motion toward his cuffs, paused and glanced in the direction of the voice. A man was stepping forward, older, maybe in his late 60s, wearing a light blue button-down tucked neatly into pressed khakis. His white hair was combed back with care, and his gait was slow but deliberate. The murmuring crowd parted slightly, making room for him as if they instinctively knew he carried authority. "I'm Judge William Carter, retired Superior Court," the man said, pulling a wallet from his pocket and flipping it open to display his judicial ID. The crowd's tension shifted slightly as whispers rippled through them. Some recognized the name immediately. Judge Carter was known in the community. Fair, no nonsense, and deeply respected. The officer squinted at the ID, then looked back at Carter. "Sir, I need you to step back. This doesn't concern." "It absolutely concerns me," the judge interrupted, his voice sharper now, like a gavel cracking in a courtroom. "I've watched this entire exchange. You have no legal grounds for what you're doing. No store personnel asked for your help. There's been no theft, no probable cause, and this man has shown you his receipt. Continuing to detain him, especially with the threat of cuffs, borders on illegal restraint. You're dangerously close to violating not just protocol but the Constitution." The cop shifted uneasily, his confidence, already shaken by the crowd and the phones pointed at him, was visibly slipping. The presence of a retired judge wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous to his authority. Every word the judge spoke would carry weight in any official investigation, especially one so publicly documented. Darnell stood still, his eyes watching Carter with a quiet sense of appreciation. He knew the man had just altered the trajectory of the encounter. The judge continued, gesturing toward the crowd. "Look around you. Every person here is witnessing your abuse of power. Every phone recording you right now is documenting a case of misconduct. You may still wear the badge, but that badge doesn't give you the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner." A woman from the crowd called out, "Tell him, Judge." Others nodded in agreement, and several began speaking into their live streams, identifying Judge Carter by name and praising his intervention. The officer licked his lips, the muscle in his jaw twitching as he weighed his next move. He opened his mouth to speak, then shut it again. He looked from Darnell to Carter, to the crowd that was now fully united against him. Judge Carter took a step closer, standing almost between the two men. "My advice to you, officer, walk away before you turn this incident into something that ends your career." There was no bluster in his tone, only calm certainty. The authority he wielded wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It came from decades of courtroom experience, from a lifetime of standing between law and injustice. The officer stepped back slightly. His shoulders sagged just enough to show that the tide was shifting. But the moment wasn't over yet. Something still hung in the air, unfinished, waiting. That's when Darnell spoke again. Darnell slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, movements measured and deliberate. "I didn't want to do this," he said, his voice carrying across the parking lot, "because I shouldn't have to." He pulled out a slim black case and flipped it open. Inside was his Navy SEAL identification, polished, official, unmistakable. The trident insignia gleamed in the sunlight, its sharp lines catching every eye in the crowd. The words United States Navy SEAL were stamped above his name and rank. Gasps spread through the crowd like a wave. The atmosphere, already tense, transformed into stunned silence followed by a flurry of whispered reactions. "He's a SEAL," someone said. "No way. Look at the ID. That's real. He risked his life for this country, and they treated him like a criminal." The officer looked at the ID, his eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't move. He didn't speak. His hands, once full of tension and aggression, now hung uselessly at his sides. Darnell held the ID up a moment longer before lowering it. "I served for 12 years. Afghanistan, Somalia, Syria. I've jumped from planes in pitch darkness, led missions in enemy territory, and buried more brothers than I care to count." His tone wasn't boastful. It was quiet, reflective, yet firm. "I fought for the right to come home and live in peace, for the right to walk into a store without being seen as a threat." The crowd was silent now, listening. "I don't wear my service on my sleeve," Darnell continued, "because real service doesn't need applause. But when someone abuses their power the way you just did, officer, it forces people like me to stand up again, not with fists, not with weapons, but with truth." He looked the officer in the eyes. "I protected people like you. I fought so you could wear that badge with honor, but today you disgraced it." The woman with the live stream turned her phone to capture Darnell's ID. "This is who they tried to shame. This is who they profiled." Another voice from the back added, "He's a hero, and he deserves better." The cop looked completely deflated now, his posture sagging, his gaze flitting between Darnell, the judge, and the sea of faces locked onto him. The truth was too big to contain, too loud to ignore. There was no recovering the power he thought he held. Darnell slowly returned his ID to his jacket, then turned to the crowd. "I appreciate you all, not because I needed protection, but because we all deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be treated with respect. No matter our color, no matter our title, no matter what we wear." Applause broke out, soft at first, then louder. People were clapping not just for the man standing tall before them, but for what he represented: strength, discipline, grace, and justice. And for the first time since the encounter began, the crowd wasn't afraid anymore. They were inspired. The moment Darnell presented his Navy SEAL credentials, the atmosphere cracked open like a thunderclap. The crowd stood in stunned silence for several seconds, letting the weight of that revelation settle into every corner of the parking lot. Then came the shift. It began with murmurs, disbelief, awe, outrage, and then it grew louder, more unified, as voices of indignation rose from every side. "You're telling me he's a Navy SEAL, and you treated him like a criminal," one woman shouted from the front. A man nearby added, "You disrespected a war hero." Every phone still pointed at the officer, capturing every inch of his discomfort, his shrinking confidence, and the slow collapse of whatever illusion of control he had held seconds earlier. The officer's face, flushed from heat and adrenaline earlier, had now lost all color. His jaw tightened as he looked around, eyes scanning the sea of phones aimed squarely at him. This wasn't going away. Every word, every second of aggression had been streamed, recorded, and possibly broadcasted to hundreds, maybe thousands, of people already. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of authority and confidence, now looked small and hollow under the scrutiny of justice. People weren't afraid of him anymore. They were disgusted, angry, and most dangerously for him, they were united. A teenage girl near the front spoke up again. "You thought you could push him around because of his skin. That's all this was." Her voice cracked, but she stood tall. "He served, he protected people like you, and this is how you treat him." The cop opened his mouth, maybe to explain, maybe to defend himself, but he couldn't find the words. Nothing he could say would compete with the reality staring him in the face. A war veteran, unjustly accused, calmly standing his ground with an entire community now standing beside him. Even Judge Carter remained firm, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. The officer glanced his way, and what he saw wasn't just judgment. It was the unmistakable certainty of accountability. Any further action on his part would become legal suicide. He wasn't dealing with just a crowd anymore. He was dealing with witnesses, professionals, and an unstoppable wave of public truth. He took a breath and stepped back, clearly rattled, clearly defeated. "You're free to go," he said under his breath, not looking Darnell in the eye. The words felt small, powerless, almost swallowed by the wind. He turned without another word and began walking toward his cruiser. A man in the crowd yelled, "Too late for that, officer," and several others echoed the sentiment. Each step he took toward the patrol car sounded like a retreat, a slow fade into shame. No more hands on the belt, no more puffed chest. He looked like a man whose entire identity had just been peeled away in front of an audience who would never forget his face. Even as the officer opened the door to his vehicle, the phone stayed trained on him, recording everything. A few bystanders moved to the front of the crowd, speaking directly into their live streams, identifying his badge number, his name, his department. One man narrated calmly, "This is Officer Greg Larson of the local PD, caught on camera profiling and threatening a decorated black Navy SEAL with no probable cause. This footage is going everywhere, trust that." And that was it. The cop got into his cruiser and shut the door, not with authority, but with a final thud that sounded more like a closing chapter. He didn't even turn on the siren. He simply drove off, slowly, with the eyes of an entire community burning into the back of his vehicle. No applause, no cheers, just heavy silence, powerful, righteous silence, from a crowd that had watched a man abuse his power and get stripped of it, not with violence, but with truth. The silence didn't last long. The moment the officer's vehicle disappeared from view, a wave of energy surged through the crowd, but this time It wasn't outrage. It was something stronger, something warmer. People began to gather around Darnell, forming a loose circle, their expressions now filled with admiration and respect. A woman in her 50s stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Darnell's shoulder. "You shouldn't have had to do that," she said, "but I'm so glad you did. We saw everything, and we won't let them twist it." The young man who had spoken earlier, the one with the cracked voice, took off his baseball cap and held it to his chest. "You're a real hero, sir, and not just because you wore the uniform, because you stood up without lashing out. You showed all of us what real strength looks like." Someone started clapping, then another joined in, then more. The applause wasn't thunderous. It was sincere, deep, resonant. It wasn't about a spectacle. It was about solidarity. The woman who had live-streamed the entire encounter stepped forward and hugged Darnell tightly. "Everyone saw it. Everyone heard you. I had hundreds of people watching, comments blowing up, people from other states messaging me already. You changed something today." Darnell, still composed, gave a modest nod, his voice steady as he responded. "I didn't want this moment. I just wanted to buy a shirt. But if this is what it took to open eyes, then maybe it was worth it." More people approached, each wanting to express something. Thanks, support, apology. A local business owner walked out from a nearby cafe with a cold drink and handed it to Darnell, apologizing for what he had witnessed. "If there's ever anything you need in this town," he said, "you've got a friend here." The retired judge stood nearby, arms crossed, face unreadable at first. Then he stepped forward and extended his hand. Darnell took it, and the two men shook hands in a moment of mutual respect that said more than words could convey. "You held your ground with honor," the judge said quietly. "It was my privilege to stand beside you." A teenage girl who had been watching everything with wide eyes approached slowly, pulling a small notebook from her backpack. "I'm writing a school paper about real-life heroes," she said shyly. Could I write about you?" That moment, tender and unexpected, struck something deep in the crowd. Darnell smiled gently and said, "If it helps others understand what's right, then absolutely." The atmosphere, once thick with confrontation and fear, had transformed into something powerful, like a community healing itself through unity. Parents explained to their kids what they had just witnessed. Elderly folks shook their heads at the injustice but smiled at the outcome, and people, black, white, Latino, young and old, stood side by side, bonded by a shared recognition of courage and truth. News spread fast. Before long, a local reporter arrived, tipped off by the viral footage. As the camera rolled, the community surrounded Darnell, not to put him on display, but to shield him, to show their alliance and their pride in standing with him. They weren't just witnesses now, they were advocates. Phones continued to buzz, notifications pouring in as the live streams were shared, re-uploaded, and dissected across platforms. People from out of town began to show support online, thanking Darnell for his service and for his example. Comment sections overflowed with empathy, outrage, and calls for change. But more than anything, they celebrated him, not for his titles, not for the medals he never mentioned, but for his unwavering sense of right and wrong, his calm resistance, and his refusal to let injustice stand unchallenged. The community didn't go back to normal that day. It rose, it awakened. It looked itself in the mirror and made a promise to do better, to be louder, and to always stand up when it counts most. In the end, this wasn't a story about a uniform, not about the Navy SEAL or the cop, not even about race, though that's the match that lit the flame. This was a story about values, about how men are revealed in moments of pressure, not comfort. You witnessed the anatomy of arrogance, a badge used as a weapon rather than a shield, and you witnessed the power of composure, a man trained in the art of war, choosing instead the discipline of peace. When the confrontation began, the air was thick with ignorance, but when truth stepped forward, documents in hand, calm in his tone, firm in his stance, the crowd saw what real power looks like, not fists. Not volume, but principle. You saw a community awaken. You saw voices rise not in chaos but in clarity. You saw what happens when one man's silent strength becomes the megaphone for justice. The racially motivated abuse didn't win the day. The community did. Integrity did. Dignity did. So what do we learn from this? That real strength is quiet. That real justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. It comes from people standing shoulder to shoulder. That when ignorance tries to impose itself through fear, it can be dismantled by truth. If you're still watching, ask yourself, who do you become under pressure? Are you the man with the badge, or the one with the backbone? This story wasn't just for Darnell. It's a mirror. What you do with your reflection, that's your legacy.